Hello, and welcome to Towards a Community of Belonging with Dr. Mijal Bitton, scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute, Yolanda Savage-Narva, Assistant Vice President of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the Union for Reform Judaism, and Gil Preuss, the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. Before we get started, please note, closed captioning is available for this program. You can view the captions by clicking View Subtitle at the bottom of your screen. Today's session is part of Ideas for Today, the Shalom Hartman Institute's national virtual learning offerings, and is also part of the Shalom Hartman Institute's partnership with the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. You can learn more about Ideas for Today in the link we will be putting in the chat. My name is Dana Bornstein, and I am the Assistant Director of Leadership and Learning at the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. If you're here with us today, you appreciate the power of Jewish ideas and the power of a strong and vibrant Jewish community. Aspirational Jewish ideas make us smarter. They compel us to take action. They are a force for good. They push our thinking on how to create the community we aspire to live in. The Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington are proud to partner with the Greater Washington Jewish community with a platform to consider the most pressing issues pertaining to Jewish identity, Jewish values, American democracy, Jewish peoplehood, and Israel. We are thrilled for the second year in a row to offer our public programs on this virtual national stage. A few logistical notes. This program is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants after the event. We will be taking questions from participants. If you have a question, please submit them at any time utilizing the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now it is my pleasure to hand it over to Gil Preuss. Gil.
Thank you, Dana. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Today we'll be talking about a topic that on the one hand seems rather simple and easy. How do we think about belonging? How do we build a community where all participants can truly belong? On the other hand, it may be one of the more complicated issues that we're going to be talking about at the same time. We are living in a moment of great divide. Politics, identity, core values are leading to fissures in the United States and within the Jewish community. As these divides get more significant, it can become an ever greater challenge to feel that one belongs. Can I truly feel at home in my community when another person's political outlook is so different than mine? What if I feel that I am not fully accepted for who I am by some other members of the community? The Jewish value of B'Tselem Elohim, that all human beings are created in God's image, requires us to ask, what is the nature of community that truly honors and cherishes all of its members in their full selves? What is our responsibility to make sure that everyone feels that they belong without needing to leave any of themselves at the door? At the same time, it raises the question of boundaries. Does a community have a right to define boundaries for its members? What happens when the expectations or needs of one person or group challenge the expectations or needs of another? Who gets to define community, including its boundaries? True community is created through our relationships with one another and the sense that our presence is felt and valued. We feel that we belong when the values that we hold and our sense of self are reflected back through the community. In the webinar today, we will explore a variety of tensions in building a vibrant Jewish community for all of its members. How do we engage the full potential in each one of us while simultaneously understanding our differences? Moreover, we will consider how we can form community across differences to co-create a vision for a culture of belonging. The aspiration of creating communities of belonging per se isn't controversial, but we know the work is hard. The controversial part of the work happens in its implementation. At times, being inclusive of one group can have the effect of excluding another. For example, some religious practices for some can have the effect of excluding others who hold different beliefs. We can also see this in the political realm, where self-described inclusive spaces, in fact, are not welcoming to those who do not share their political inclinations. Similarly, the process of building inclusive spaces for some alienates others through language or ideas. Before we start, though, I'd like to differentiate a few ideas. Today, we are not focusing on individual preferences. Let me give you an example. When I moved to Boston about 20 years ago, I went into a synagogue for Kol Nidre services and felt immediately that this was not the style for me. The level of formality, the frontal service, etc., were designed for others. I left and went into a different synagogue where I found my community. What we're focusing on today is when groups as defined by particular identities feel that they belong or are excluded, and what should be done about that, if anything. Moreover, we will consider the difference when a community wants to be inclusive of another and states it at its core value, yet simultaneously sustains a culture or practices that suggest otherwise. Finally, we will consider the different responses needed when the particular identity group has been historically marginalized in the Jewish community or American society. Does bringing historically marginalized groups into Jewish spaces require changes among the people who have been in the dominant culture? Are we simply saying to the other, feel free to join us as we are, or do we need to jointly seek change and share the discomfort? It is at this point where the group which has defined the community in their own image and liking it as it is being asked to change that we face challenges. When should a group be asked to change and when not? When do we even want an existing group or community to change? And when should we just build something new? I would also like to highlight one additional item. I recognize that some of the language used itself can get politicized. Throughout this conversation, I'm going to push the speakers to get behind the language and ensure we have shared meaning and understanding and acknowledge when we don't. If there are times when I fail to do so, or if there are particular words or concepts that require further clarification, please note that in the Q&A function. I will do my best to track these questions so that at a minimum, we can understand each other, even if we don't always agree. So today, it is my pleasure to introduce two really incredible people. The first is Dr. Mijal Bitton. Dr. Bitton is a scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute and co-founder of the Downtown Minyan in New York City. Mijal received her doctorate from NYU, where she conducted an ethnographic study of a Syrian Jewish community with a focus on developing the field of contemporary Sephardic studies in America. And I'm sure we will touch on some of that work. The second guest today is Yolanda Savage-Narva. Yolanda is the Assistant Vice President of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the Union for Reform Judaism. Yolanda was previously the Executive Director of Operation Understanding DC, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting understanding, cooperation, and respect, while fighting to eradicate racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of discrimination. Yolanda is a Federation board member, an educator and fellow for our Jewish Community Leadership Program. So first of all, welcome both Mijal and Yolanda to the program today. I'm super excited to have you both here.
Thank you so much, Gil.
Thank you. As we start, I'm really going to just really turn to you. I gave some formal introductions, but I'm going to ask you to tell a little bit about who you are and your story besides your work. So to give people some context about where we each start this conversation. So perhaps, Mijal, you can go first, and then Yolanda, you will follow up.
Sure, and thank you so much for this opportunity. You named so many big questions, and I'm eager to start conversing on them. I guess I'll just share a little bit about my personal background. I was born in Buenos Aires to a family of Syrian, Moroccan, and Spanish ancestry. And when I was 12 years old, my family moved to the US. My introduction to America and to American Jewry was through a Persian Jewish community in Long Island. So I had this understanding of American Jews and America through the eyes of immigrant Persian Jews. And that ended up shaping a lot of my journey as somebody who lived in many different communities at the same time. I'll say that right now, like you mentioned before, I work at the Shalom Hartman Institute. I lead a spiritual community. And I guess what's important for me to name here as well is that I am part of communities that represent different worldviews and different experiences. I'm part of communities that are strictly halachic and that center obligation, and I'm part of communities that center autonomy and choice. I'm part of communities that are politically conservative, and I'm part of communities that are politically liberal. I'm part of communities made up of immigrants. I'm part of communities made up of many generations Americans. And I'm part of communities that really span the diversity of the ethnic and racial identities that all of us American Jews occupy. So I'm really excited to be here to speak about belonging and hopefully to reflect from the experiences that I have in being part of these different communities.
Thank you, Mijal. Yolanda.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you both. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to having this discussion around communities of belonging. So again, I'm Yolanda Savage-Narva. I use the she, her pronoun series, and I am sitting on Pamunkey, Piscataway, and Anacostan ancestral lands, also known as Washington, D.C. I'm always struck by this question because I'm finding that I answer it differently depending on the audience. But I do usually talk about my parents because they are a very important pillar to who I am. My dad grew up in the segregated South Side of Chicago. He was one of 10 kids, 9 boys and a girl. My mom grew up with a teenage mom in the bayous of Natchez, Mississippi during the height of the civil rights movement. And neither of my parents went to college. My mom went to college and didn't finish. My dad never went to college. And my parents basically were a lower middle class family when I was growing up. And I wonder how that sets with the measurement of success in this society. But one thing that I keep in mind around success is that my parents really, in spite of all of that, instilled values in my brother and I that really pushed us to be confident and pushed us to really have a strong sense of self. And so those things are very important to me and are part of how I've navigated where I am today and are part of the arc of the history that really informs how I see the world. There are a couple of things that are really foundational over the arc of history that I want to share with you today. And I think the first one is really moving from the north to the south, moving from Chicago, where I was born, to Mississippi, which is where I was raised, and the opportunity to kind of see both of those worlds and see how things were connected for people who look like me, no matter where we grew up, was really powerful for me. And I would say the second piece is that I was always taught to meet people where they are. And that's something that I have relied on in my journeys around thinking about communities of belonging and really setting those pillars in place for how I navigate that work. And I know we'll talk more about that, but those are 2 things that jump out for me.
Thank you so much. Each one of you brings obviously critical personal histories and experiences and families to this conversation, particularly in a country where up until very recently, the assumption was that the Jewish community is a series made up of Ashkenazi Jews. And we learn more and more about the greater diversity. And so hopefully over the course of the conversation, we can also think about kind of some of those issues. So I guess, Yolanda, I'll start with you. When you think about belonging, so the topic is that we want to talk about is belonging. How would you define it? I mean, when you work in this area, you're working with congregations throughout the country. How do you think about a community of belonging or the idea of belonging?
Gil, at the beginning of your opening remarks, you articulated it so beautifully that belonging seems to be something that's simple, like everyone belongs, but it's really complex. And I actually define belonging using a quote that Maya Angelou shared back in 1973 when she was being interviewed by Bill Moyers. And it's so powerful to me, and it orbits how I think about belonging. And he asked her a series of questions. Do you feel like you belong? What do you think the meaning of belonging is? And she said this, that you are not free until you realize that you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all. The price is high and the reward is great. And I think about that a lot because there's so much that is a part of creating a community of belonging. So for me, within that orbit, that means that we have to have a belief in B'Tselem Elohim, that all people are created in the divine image. I think that in order to create communities of belonging, that we have to believe in truth and really work hard to seek it out. It's grounded in strength. It's grounded in Azut de Kadosha, this holy boldness that we have to seek in order to sometimes push things in a different direction to make sure that people feel a sense of belonging. And I think it's anchored, honestly, in compassion for fellow humans, and then in openness and love. And so those are the key ingredients in my mind around belonging. And they all have to kind of align and be in a space together that really allows people to bring in who they truly are into the community and co-create it together.
So it sounds very much kind of for you, a lot of it has to do with the relationships that exist across people in a space. I mean, it sounds like a lot of that is, I mean, it's relationships, but it's also with the larger context, it sounds like.
Yes, and I mean, being in proximity to one another is the only way we truly build relationships. If people are outside on the margins, we're using stereotypes and things that have been planted in our brains to define people. When we don't really take the time to get to know people and be proximate with them, it's hard to really create that community together.
Thank you. Mijal, how would you define belonging? Is similar or different? And especially a community, we think about a community of belonging.
Yeah, well, I loved everything you just shared, Yolanda. I'm still thinking about it and taking notes on your Torah that you're sharing. But I'll say, Gil, when I think about belonging, at least in its highest formulation, right? So I'm not saying we always achieve it, but at least aspirational belonging, the concept that comes to mind is the idea of covenant, the idea of berit that we have in our tradition. And I'm very much inspired by the teachings of my late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who wrote a lot and taught a lot about covenant. And the way that covenant to me relates to belonging is that if you believe that you are part of a covenantal community, if you are part of a covenantal relationship, then you don't just believe that you are allowed to be there, that you have permission to be there, but you believe that you are needed, that this covenant is not cannot fully live up to its promise, to what it's supposed to do in the world, if you are not present there and you are not contributing to it. So when I think, whether in my own local community, proximity, Yolanda, you just mentioned, or whether in like a broader context of Jewish peoplehood or American citizenship or the like, I think a lot about what it means to inculcate a sense of responsibility, to feel like this project is not whole if I am not part of it. And that literally transforms your ability to belong somewhere. If you don't feel like you're a passive spectator, or if you're just another person there, but that you are a necessary and required part of that project, that the relationship, again, whether you want to use religious language, the relationship with God, with each other, with our tradition, that it is not complete until each person is there and serving a particular role. So that's like the big, idealistic kind of notion of belonging. But I do think I can bring it down, closer to earth or to communal structures, that I really want to ask myself, I want to ask each other, what do we have to do to make people feel not just like they're walking in, but that they are responsible for the project? Because feeling responsible means that you feel agency. It means that you feel like this is dependent on you and like you get to shape the place that you are in together with other people. So that's the notion of belonging, the covenantal notion of belonging that I find, as my North Star. How we apply it, we can talk more about it.
So let me kind of push on some of these two pieces, because I heard a couple of different things I just want to tease out. So one is the larger concept of being part of a covenantal community, that we're all part of this Jewish people, that we have responsibility in relationship to God. And because of that, because I'm part of this covenantal community, I have responsibility. I belong. Regardless of what you say, I know I belong, because this is part of our collective endeavor. And so some of it is kind of, there's that issue of, I have agency, I have responsibility, I'm part of something larger. There's another piece that I heard, which is the shape of the human interaction and the nature, or maybe, I don't know if it was specifically said or the way I've heard it frequently, the culture that may exist tells me whether I belong or not. And the role of either relationships or particular culture in an organization sends a message. And so when we think about belonging, when we think about individuals, to what degree is it in people feeling themselves as part of this Jewish people? And I can go into a synagogue or a Jewish community and I can feel I belong. Or is it implicit in the culture that exists that tells me whether I belong or not? How do we tease out those two pieces, not just in theory, but in the experiences of people's lives in the community?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I think I understand the question, Gil, but I would just say that I don't think of it as a binary. I think that we have to work from multiple angles. I think that the culture of a community can be one that communicates to individuals that they're not just welcomed in, to participate, but they're welcome to shape the space and they're welcome to take responsibility, right? But that also then comes back to individuals, right? To then come in and to say part of what it means to belong is that I'm responsible to help shape this and help shape it in my image and your image and our image and in the way that we're creating something together. So I just think that we need to, again, it's not a binary. We definitely need to work on cultures and structures and how to make sure that people feel that they're part of it. But I guess all I'm trying to say is that the places where I feel most like I belong are places that I feel like this is part of a shared enterprise, where I help shape it. And that's the ideal place that I think we need to get to in a lot of different ways.
I appreciate that, Mijal. And this covenant, kind of foundation, I think is really important. And one thing you said that really jumps out at me is this role of responsibility and accountability that I think is a very important component of moving into a space and using that as kind of one of the pillars of belonging. I think that there are multiple entry points into creating those spaces as well. And that is not a binary. There's this individual responsibility, and then there's the collective responsibility as well. Putting, kind of reality into it, it is a challenge for individuals to walk into a space and not feel like they are welcomed or belong, at any, extent of our imaginations, if they don't even feel that they're welcome. And so there's that piece that the individual role has to be teased out. And then there's the kind of structural communal space that's important as well. And so it's a both and, I think, if I could bring that terminology into our conversation, that it's not a one size fit all where we need to work on the individual piece or the collective piece. It's the both that will make that community stronger.
Okay, so given that context, I'd like to think a little bit about the Jewish community. We're going to start, getting bigger and bigger to a certain extent. And this is not meant, it may sound like a rhetorical question. It's not meant that way. Is it possible to build a Jewish community where or a Jewish organization? I'll start with that. It could be a synagogue, could be a federation, it could be any other part, a Jewish institution where all members of the Jewish community feel that they belong. And you can divide them up to a certain extent. And answers could be yes or no. And if it's in either case, if it's no, what would be the factors that would differentiate?
I mean, a quick answer is yes and no. I think that belonging is something that's created by the members of the community. And so when the members of the community are there together in a space, co-creating what that looks like, that is a space of belonging for them. As we bring more people into the community, that space may not be a space of belonging for them. That may be more of a welcoming space. And so when we are continuing to expand our community and looking at all of the diversity of that community, we have to recognize that this is something that's fluid. And in order for us to make sure these spaces are belonging for everyone, we have to bring members into the community and bring their diversity of thought and their diversity of experiences to the conversation, to the table, in order to make sure it's a space of belonging. So it can, in my opinion, it has to continue to evolve in order to be a space with this foundational piece of what it means to be Jewish. And that may be different for everyone, but we want people to experience that in the way that is important and special for them to feel like they belong.
Is there, Yolanda, is there a limit from your perspective beyond which an organization can't stretch or can't define itself? Let me give you an example. That was Federation, we run some programs, and we were reaching out to other Jewish organizations to co-sponsor. I got a call from the head of Jews for Jesus at, I think in Northern Virginia in this case, and he wanted to co-sponsor. And I said, well, you're not a Jewish organization. He said, yes, we are. I said, well, there's a significant challenge here. And he then gave examples, which I'm not going to say out loud, where he felt we've already deviated from traditional Judaism. And I said, well, there's a pretty big difference. Now, obviously, that's in my mind, a relatively simple boundary that we said, who's within the Jewish community, who's outside. Now, to differentiate from that extreme one, do Jewish organizations have the right or even the need at times to set boundaries, because without which they will lose meaning and a sense of self?
I think meaning and a sense of self is definitely important, and it is something that may be one way in one instance and another way in another instance. And I think that assessing what that is at that moment in time and who you're partnering with and what your message is to the community is important. And yes, there are boundaries, there are limits to creating communities of belonging, because you can't lose the sense of who we are as Jewish people in the process. So I think, yes, that there are limits and boundaries, and those things are on a case-by-case basis too, depending on what the discussion is and what the outcomes of the partnership or relationships are.
Mijal?
Yeah, I'm happy to I'll share 3 thoughts in reaction to your question about the possibility of, can we really include everybody, be truly belonging for everybody? My first reaction is that it's not even just a Jewish community question, but any sort of collective enterprise, an organization, an institution, a family, a nation, will by its nature include some people and exclude others. It just like by nature of the idea of a we, it has to be able to, to hold a collective together. So I actually just start from the assumption that there's always going to be people in and people out. And the question is, how do you negotiate that? How transparent are you on those boundaries? What are the values that guide, who's inside? I read an article by a professor of sociology in Israel, Nissim Mizrahi, who writes a lot about Mizrahi Jews in Israel. And one of the things that he often talks about is, he says, we often ask who's invited to sit at the table. And he says, but which kind of table is it? Sometimes even the nature of the table will end up kind of including people or not. Like there's all of these conscious and subconscious, explicit and implicit choices that we make all the time. And I see them as human, and I see them as normal. And I want to try to have a conversation as to like, what do this actually look like? The second reaction I have, and here I just think we have to really name this, I do think that sometimes there is a trade-off between thinness and thickness of like the values that hold a collective together and how wide the tent is. Okay, that the wider a tent is, often the lowest the common denominator that people have. And that's a trade-off. And I might say there are times when I want that, when I want the widest tent possible. And I might say there's times when actually I want to invest in a type of community that has a certain thickness in terms of shared values and shared commitments and shared ways of being in this group. And this might be needed for a particular parts of my life. So I think we need to have a conversation around the thinness and the thickness I think Yolanda, you spoke at one point about truth, right? And I'm really into truth and into honesty and into just naming the trade-offs and calculus that we make in our leadership decisions. So I do think that we need to be honest about those and how we think about it. The third reaction, and this will be the last one, but the third reaction to your question, Gil, is I think that part of what concerns me is there's often different impulses, right? In society at different times towards different things. And I think that I increasingly hear people claim that for them to belong, the community needs to be remade in a particular way. So what do I mean by this? Like, I'll give you a personal example. Like, I have been told that as a traditional Jew who follows certain traditional law, if I refuse to renounce certain traditional, Jewish precepts, that will automatically mean that I am excluding somebody or making them feel like they don't belong in the community with me, even if I'm not trying to push it into them. You understand the difference there, right? So I've experienced those moments in recent years in which I sense a certain type of ideology in which people say, well, I don't belong if you don't agree with certain things or follow certain views. So if that is the expectation, if that is the increased expectation for what it means to foster communities of belonging, then not only do I want to name all of the costs and benefits analysis that we have to make, but I actually want to argue that we have to differentiate between different notions of what it means to create communities of belonging.
So let me ask one more particular question related to that, Mijal. So you're the spiritual leader at the Downtown Minyan. And I imagine in creating it, you had to define what the community was going to look like and what the definitions were going to be and what are the core values and implicitly what are the boundaries. Well, you may not start with what are the boundaries, but it's, we start with core values and, and beliefs, etc. When you think about that, I guess, kind of, what were those things that you felt were legitimate for defining kind of the sense of community? And perhaps what are some issues that were not legitimate to define boundaries?
Let me answer, but not precisely, okay? I'll answer it in a different way. The way that I thought about this, and I don't work alone, I have colleagues and people who lead the community with me, but I try to inculcate what I understand to be a Sephardic traditional model of community building and of belonging, which is a model in which the community can have certain values and principles and have certain clear ways as to how we operate. So as an example, our community follows traditional Jewish law in a clear way with all of what that means. And at the same time, traditionally, and I'm not saying all Sephardi communities, but traditionally many Sephardi communities wanted to invite everybody to come in, no matter how people identified or behaved. So I view that as a balance of saying we are a space in which we believe in certain things, we practice in certain ways. And when you walk into the door, no one's asking you, do you practice this way? Do you believe this? We just tell you, come, enjoy, spend Shabbat together, volunteer, lead, learn, pray, and be part of this community. So that to me is like the model that I grew up with and that I think is actually really, really valuable, that offers both a sense of confidence around saying we want to stand for certain things, right? And at the same time, inviting people to be part of this project without pretending ever like we all practice the same way or we all believe in the same things. So there's not that expectation. I'll say one more thing here. One of the things that I have really done and worked on is when I get people who move to the neighborhood and I have coffee with them and we talk, I often try to help them see it is a community where they would feel comfortable, where they want to come and join. And if I ever sense that they're looking for something else, I will work really hard with them to help them find the best, most perfect place where they will feel like their Jewish practice can flourish. I would always invite them to come, but I also believe that Jewish communities are an ecosystem and there's many of us. And sometimes like for Shabbat morning services, we might choose different ones of them, even as we help each other, even as we welcome each other to come in, even as we partner on different things. So that's the way that I view it, at least in that space. And the last thing I'll say is I believe I have different communal configurations in different spaces. So we've made these choices in this particular spiritual place that's very much tied to questions of ritual and practice. And I might make different ones if I'm in a different kind of setting. But that's the delicate line that I strive for in terms of just inviting everybody in and also holding on to certain normative understandings of what we want to stand for.
So thank you, Mijal. So Yolanda, you work with synagogues throughout the country. You work with them and help them think through issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. To have them think about what do they want to be, what culture, how do they want to think about themselves. I guess I would ask you a similar type of question when you're working with the Reform synagogues. Are there core issues that are defining what they are pursuing? And do they think about boundaries or not? And what those may look like as they approach kind of the changes that they're seeking to create as a community?
It's an excellent question, Gil, because there's this saying in healthcare, if you've seen one health department, you've seen one health department. If you've seen one synagogue, you've seen one synagogue. And the synagogues are in various places around this work and what it means to create a community of belonging. I will say that the majority of the synagogues that I've worked with are very focused on maintaining the core of how they do their rituals and how they do their services, and making sure that in addition to that, that people feel like they can come into the community and help create some of the things around those pieces. And I think that, and that's not everyone, but that's the core for the synagogues that I've worked with as well. I mean, I'll bring in the camping community. The URJ has 15 camps around the country, and there is a huge, very important focus on what it means to be Jewish. And at the same time, the camps are understanding that in order to do that in the most inclusive way, that there has to be a focus on making sure those people, and I don't like using this term, but I think it's the term that we have right now, who live on the margins of the Jewish community feel a place of belonging in order to make that community as vibrant as possible. So, there's there are trade-offs that happen, but I think that there's this core tenet around pride and being Jewish that is the focal point of the camping communities and the synagogues and congregations that I work with. And I think that's important.
So I want to kind of tease out, and not tease out, but I want to kind of further explore one of those issues that you just raised, which is the responsibility of the Jewish community to groups that I think you said, live on the margins. Other people talk about marginalized communities, but segments of Jewish life that in the past, may not have felt that they belonged. And this could be along race, it could be gender identity, it could be disabilities, it could be a variety of other groups as well, and kind of their particular challenge and the role of the Jewish community in thinking through what we do in a different way. And I guess, if there's kind of the core sense of what are the values that a particular organization may have, what is the responsibility of not the Jewish community writ large, but of any particular organization to think differently about themselves and who they are, to make it a place where people who have been historically on the margin feel that they do belong?
I think that the responsibility lies in two places. One is this individual piece. I sometimes use this terminology, mirrors and windows. And the mirrors piece is really basically what it is holding the mirror up, understanding that we live in a system that has been created with a hierarchy based on people's skin color and immutable traits, and that those things are embedded in us, and regardless of who we are, and being able to be aware of that and to address those things as an individual who is a part of a collective community, whether it's an organization or it's a congregation or it's a school, that we have to make sure that we're doing the work of addressing the implicit biases that we all carry. We won't make those go away. We have an amygdala and a hippocampus that are part, of how we're wired, and those things are going to not going away, but address them, be aware of them, and then deal with them accordingly. And then there has to be this real focus on how institutions are embedding these principles and practices and how they do business and how they recruit people and how they think about who's a part of the community and who's not. And so this takes time, but it's a necessary part of the process in order to really think about how are we moving people from the margins into our community. So at some point, my aspiration is that we are not talking about marginalized communities anymore. Everyone is a part of the community, and people aren't feeling like I'm knocking on the door saying, can you let me into your space?
Yeah, can I just add something that was, I love what you just said, Yolanda. I'll say also that often when I speak to people, I say, if certain people are not included or they're underrepresented or they're in the margins, like we just said, they're not the only ones being hurt. It's the Jewish community. It's the Jewish people, right? It's this notion of, apologies, this notion of covenant that our collective isn't complete if we're not, bringing everybody in. So to me, there's actually there's a spiritual cost there for the community if we don't take this seriously. And I do think that we have a responsibility to interrogate those barriers. All of the things that you just said, Yolanda, I'll add to them, we can add so many. I'll just name also, I think a lot about barriers in terms of class, how expensive it is to be part of a Jewish community, barriers in terms of literacy. If you walk into a Jewish space and everybody's speaking Hebrew and you just have no clue what's going on, it's very hard to continue to come and to feel invested. So I think we have to do a lot of work to interrogate these barriers.
Excellent points.
So at the same time, we also know that across Jewish life, there are a lot of different organizations. I mean, there are a lot of different synagogues. Personally, I've been part of at least 2 startup synagogues. I mean, there seems to be like a rite of passage. You know, you have to start a synagogue or something, or break away from a synagogue. And it's all because people have somewhat different views about how they define community, what kind of practice do they want. It could be, you know, a physical issue, whatever. And so this constant kind of new creation. Also, when we think about kind of Jewish life, when we think about how do we actually build kind of this future, I guess it's 2 points. One is I'd love to hear your vision for the larger kind of Jewish communal space. Do we all need to figure out how to make everyone belong? Do we need to figure out a place where everyone has some place where they belong? Is it incumbent upon the individuals to find a place for themselves? What does this look like as we go forward? And whose responsibility is it to take this on and to really build a community of belonging?
I think Mijal and I almost have it figured out.
We did it. That's it. We can go home. I'll just say one thing, Gil, you know, mentioning startup organizations and the like. I think that part of what it means to think about the Jewish people writ large is to think, at least the way that I approach it, is to me, there's an ecosystem, right? And there's different communities and different organizations. And they don't have to be the same. And they can actually fall in different spectrums. Take the example I just gave. Some places maybe want to pray in a way that is all in Hebrew, and that makes sense for that particular group of people. There should be other spaces that have like different layers of accessibility for different folks. And we shouldn't be so threatened by others that we don't want them to flourish and succeed, even if we're different from each other. So I do think we need to think a little bit more in this way, in trying to promote other settings amongst the inclusivity or belonging spectrum and different choices that we make, and understanding that different individual Jews and different Jewish communities are going to differ from each other. I'll also add that I think as a Jewish community, we have to continuously dance between 2 different types of values or 2 different notions of the dignity of difference, right? We have to think about individuals being created b'tselem Elokim, right? What that means to have individuals feel this way. And we also have to think about the dignity of group difference. What happens when you have particular groups, particular communities who stand for certain values or certain ways of being or certain commitments, and you don't want them to have to give those up in order to, you know, to have the most open tent possible, in which the result of that would mean that they cannot exist according to the values that they uphold and that they represent. So to me, there's this dance. It's not clear. It's both and, right? Like Yolanda said, of trying to think through these things and trying to understand that we're going to be different from each other. And I'm, you know, Hartman, pluralism all the way. I think it's really important to uplift that and to understand that we're going to be making different choices and that that's okay.
I agree, Mijal. I think there's beauty in difference. And if we figure out how to embrace differences and understand that people will create new opportunities because they're looking for that space of belonging if they haven't been able to find that in some sort of established institution already, is okay. And I think one of the tenets for me around belonging is understanding that different people will want to belong to different settings, and that is okay, and not judging that, and understanding that some people will want to be a part of a community that has a tent that's growing and some people won't. And is the tent always the thing that people need to be under? Do they need to maybe be in a different setting? And just being flexible with the view, like you said, Mijal, around the ecosystem, that ecosystem will have all sorts of micro environments in it. And I want everyone to be happy in those environments that they're in.
Right. I mean, to a certain extent, and this is, actually, I should know who coined the phrase, and I'm not sure how I feel about the marketplace of ideas. And I mean, we're seeing that in the Jewish community, right? I mean, some synagogues and organizations are growing, others are shrinking. Some of it could be geographic reasons, but others have to do with the nature of the organization and who feels that they're part of it and whether they want to be part of that particular community. And that will be part of our future. I mean, how do we adapt to also meet the needs of the continually changing Jewish community and what they are looking for? And how do we inspire people to connect in ways that may be different in the years ahead as opposed to what they were just a few years ago? And that's going to be something that we're going to be looking at. We got one question in the chat that kind of touched on this. If we're focusing on moving towards many flourishing micro communities, what ties us together? I mean, is it the idea that we're all part of this covenantal community? Is there something different, or is that at the end of the day, as long as we feel that we're part of some larger Jewish people with both a shared past and a shared future, but is there anything else that will tie the Jewish community, the Jewish people together if we operate in these, internally defined micro communities?
What a question. This sometimes keeps me up at night. Like, this question of what does it mean to both really emphasize the local communities and ways of being and the need for those, and also what does it mean to have Jewish peoplehood? I think for me, it's like a very basic level. If when we say we, and there's different we's, but if one of our we's is the Jewish people, and if we feel responsible for each other or to help each other when we're in trouble, that to me is like the necessary condition to then think about a Jewish people that transcends our smaller communities, because there are big challenges that often we face. And I think it's really critical to maintain both an affinity, an investment in smaller communities, and also to be able even to have this conversation. We all come from different communities, and we are talking to each other using sometimes the same, sometimes different values, and hopefully caring for each other and wanting each other to succeed and being willing to be there for each other.
And thank you, Mijal, for that. I think it is a complex question. And I think that individuals will make those decisions about what is core for them. And me personally, yes, the covenantal piece is core for me. That is a big part of who I am. It's a big part of my connection to the Jewish community. And I know that others don't necessarily have that connection. And so what is it that is core for us as the Jewish people? And I think it is the need to be here, to be alive, and to be in a broader community, in our own community, but then to be a part of the broader community as well. And so I personally am still working on how you kind of tease that out as a collective, because I think it's such an individual conversation and probably an internal struggle for some people.
So there are a few more questions that I want to bring up from the chat, and hang on one second. So first of all, in terms of the question about the Jewish people, we've been talking a lot about synagogues. Now, only around 25% of all Jews belong to a synagogue at any point in time. Is that who we're only thinking about in these conversations? Are we thinking about other institutions? What about people who aren't connected to any institution? Is there a way, to send the message, or is it really an institution-based experience that we're struggling with? And I guess when you think about belonging, is it tied to organizations, or is it tied to, I feel like I belong to the Jewish people?
Yeah. I have to tell you that we have these conversations all the time, because if you look at institutions in general in the broader community, people are not joining organizations. They're not joining faith-based institutions at the rate that they were at one time. And so what is our pivot to make sure that people who don't see themselves as part of an institution also feel like they belong? And I think there are multiple ways to do that. And we haven't figured out all of these ways, but an example that I have is really reaching out to people who self-identify as Jews of color and creating what we call affinity spaces for people who want to be a part of that community that's not connected to a congregation or a synagogue, but there are opportunities to meet up and be a part of a community and bring your Jewish lens to that community in the way that you see it being most powerful. And so, that's an example of that. I think the institution, the building itself is an important place, but it's not the only place to gather and the only place to build community.
Yeah, I agreed. We are in deep trouble if we're only thinking about institutions or only about synagogues to engage with American Jews. And I think we all play different roles. We have different strengths. I love thinking about what does it mean to learn Torah together, to learn Jewish wisdom together, which transcends institutions, transcends geographical proximity. And it can be a really powerful way to bring Jews from different places together and to have something in common in which you build relationships and build networks that could be at times independent from institutions.
So now I want to shift significantly in a way, and we're going to have a series of questions that kind of go in different levels. So I've always believed, and I still do, that the Jewish community has the capacity to overcome many of the differences that are ripping apart American society. And I believe that because exactly, Mijal, of what you said, this covenantal idea that there's something larger than American politics that holds us together, that we have some vested interest. And for some people, it might be defined by anti-Semitism. For other people, it might be kind of history, or it might be halakha, whatever, but that there's something that goes beyond the immediate world that ties us together so that there is an inherent interest to kind of hold the community together. Now, that may be idealistic, but I believe that in terms of the potential. The question that was asked is, given all that, we do live in very challenging times. The differences in American society driven by politics seem to be getting starker and starker. Every time, personally, I feel like we've hit a limit, we seem to go beyond that. What can we do? What can Jewish leaders do to confront that and to actually try to create communities where people across the divides of America can come together? Or are we destined to have organizations that reflect American society and the divisions that we see?
I'm happy to to take a stab at this. I think that inside the Jewish community, we have a similar challenge to just in American society as a whole, which is that very often there's like smaller extremes that have very high visibility and that are very loud, and they end up shaping the conversation. And I think that there's probably similar things that happen in the Jewish community that again, if you want to talk as a binary in either extreme or like whatever, in the extremes, whatever those are, that there's going to be people who don't want to continue to invest in a notion of togetherness across difference. But in my perspective, that's a minority. That's a smaller but visible minority in terms of American Jews. So I've heard people just talk in terms of American politics about having a coalition of the sane, right? What would it mean to just like focus on that, to maybe not pay undue attention to the extremes, and to actually invest very strongly in people who want to be in relationship with each other across difference. And I wonder what that would look like in the Jewish community. And this goes back to our conversation around, can everybody belong? maybe everybody can belong as long as you actually want to work on this project of saying we don't all need to be exactly the same to be to be responsible for each other. So I do think there's, you spoke about the marketplace. I think there's a market for this. And I think it's not easy. It's so much easier to talk about it on like a Zoom call than to actually do it. It can even be dangerous for leaders to have moderate positions in these days. But I do think it's critical to begin thinking in this way.
So in our last 10 minutes or so, I want to touch on, I guess, I don't know if there are two third rails in Jewish life, but if there are, we're going to try to touch on them, which have to do with race and Israel. And so, Yolanda, I mean, I'll start with you. I mean, you do a lot of work on DEI, obviously. You led OUDC, a phenomenal program, and thinking about the unique challenges in American society of creating a Jewish community where particularly Black Jews feel that they belong. Both, can you say a little bit about that and some of the work that you're doing, and perhaps some of the success and struggles related to that?
Sure. I would start with the social construction of race and understanding that the United States, and we could talk about globally as well, that the United States created race and racism and created this hierarchy that has been able to be the dominant point of contention in this country. I would argue more than 400 years. If we go back to the genocide of the indigenous peoples, this idea that people who don't fit a certain category are less than or evil or have some ill intent. And this has been planted, I think, in our society, and the people who perpetrate this and the people who are also in the position where they are disenfranchised and dehumanized and experience the impacts of systemic racism and oppression. And because of that, one of the most challenging things that we have got to root out is racism, and that racism exists in the broader community, and racism exists within our own Jewish community as well. And I often have conversations with people who talk about the things that they've done to be a part of eradicating racism. One prominent example is the civil rights movement, and a third of the people who came from the North were people who self-identified as white Jews and worked hand in hand with people from the South to register people to vote and to be a part of making things better in the South. And we still have to deal with the seeds of racism that have been planted within all of us. And that is a really challenging place to be, because people kind of get in a binary around good and bad. Like if I have racist ideology or I have implicit bias, I'm a bad person. And if I don't, then I'm a good person. When we have to get out of this binary thinking that we all have these implicit biases, and we're in a racist society, and we have to root that out in order for our Jewish community to truly see specific Jews of color in general, specifically Black Jews, as a part of the community and not someone that you're welcoming in who are kind of on the fringes of the community. And that is one of the major challenges of this work.
Thank you. So Mijal, I guess I'll turn to you for the other one around Israel. It was noted in the chat, and it was recently in the paper, there's a synagogue in Chicago that explicitly defined itself as anti-Zionist. And that's now kind of part of their agenda. They don't believe that the state of Israel should exist. For a lot of people, that would suggest that they are no longer or should no longer be part of the Jewish community. And so I guess the question is, as conversations about Israel and different parts of the Jewish community see our relationship in radically different ways, how do you think we should be thinking about that part of our Jewish identity, our Jewish community, when we create boundaries, or should we not be focusing on that to the same way?
Right. So we're beginning to end with like the light easy questions, right? Of course. Yeah. I mean, you're touching in such complicated and difficult issues. I'll give a couple of reactions, just broadly. I think that, like I said before, each community needs to define its boundaries and its principles. And I think there's nothing wrong with a community saying, this is what we stand for, including Zionism, including believing in the legitimacy of the state of Israel, including, and for you to be part of this community, this is one of our key values. I also distinguish between, I think there's a difference between being an anti-Zionist institution and being a non-Zionist institution. Imagine how somebody would feel if I had like an pick any other group, anti-Orthodox, whatever, synagogue. I think there's like a difference there in terms of renouncing, of not being something and actually being built explicitly in opposition to something else. And I think what the underlying factor that makes this conversation so complicated is the incredibly twisted and not so easy to carefully define relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So that's part of like what makes this so complicated. The last thing I'll say, at least with regards to this, is that I think we need to do just a better job in taking nuanced positions. What do I mean by this? There's a difference between excluding somebody, excommunicating them, battling them, opposing them, and not giving them a platform, let's say, or inviting them in. To me, there's like a really important difference there, and it's a nuanced difference. So I feel comfortable with certain groups, right, that represent something else to say, you know what, like our views are so diametrically opposed and you are constructed in a way that goes against one of my core values. I have no obligation to say that this community should reflect you and that we should give you a platform and all of that. It doesn't mean that that comes together, and I'm not talking about this example, I'm talking more broadly. It doesn't mean that that is the same as saying, I am now going to view my mission as going after you and trying to exclude you from other places and trying to, whatever language you want to use, cancel you, whatever that is. I think there's a nuanced difference there, and we need to be able to return to nuanced positions in highly polarized times. And when there's so much moral outrage, we need to be able, I think, to really take a step back and to and do our best. Not always easy, right? But to have wisdom to be nuanced with these things.
Thank you. And I apologize for bringing some of the more challenging questions right at the end. What I'd like to do is, first of all, thank you everyone who has joined and put the questions into the chat function. We really appreciate it. I would like to turn to both of you and ask you, what is making you hopeful today? We can end on something more positive as we go forward. Yolanda, why don't you start, and then we'll finish with you, Mijal.
I love this question. I'll be brief and say that one of the things that's making me hopeful is that we have young Jews who are really willing to push us to think differently. Not just younger Jews, but specifically, they come to mind for me. And I've been pushed. I've had conversations where I just didn't see things in a certain way. And it's been really refreshing and agitational and all the ways that agitational is good, to get that feedback and to really step back and think about what my role is today to make sure my descendants and my descendants have a community where they can feel like they can bring their entire whole selves to that community and feel liberated and strong and a sense of belonging.
Thank you. Mijal?
Yeah, what a good question, right? I think that in the past, I don't know how many months or so, as thank God, COVID rates have been receding. I know we're not out of the woods yet, but I've been having so many more in-person interactions with people that I haven't, the past couple of years. And it brings me back to a word that you used, Yolanda, at the beginning, that of proximity. I really think that the ability to stand in front of each other, to see each other, to talk to each other, suddenly we're not ideas or sides of different teams or ideological opponents or whatever that is, but we are messy people who are sometimes confused, sometimes confident, sometimes sure, sometimes struggling. And there's something really transformative that I think we forget how important it is until it's taken away, right? But I've been reminded so often in the past couple of months how critical it is to really have these interactions with each other and to be able to overcome just notions of who the other is and to get to know each other instead.
So thank you, Mijal. Thank you, Yolanda. It has been a pleasure to be in conversation with both of you. And I really appreciate everything that you do to really elevate these issues and to both, in your work in so many different ways. I appreciate the partnership that we've had with the Shalom Hartman Institute for these past many years. And Yolanda, the work that we have done together within the greater Washington community. You're both just incredible leaders, really making this a better community and country in so many ways. I'd like to thank all the people who joined us today for this webinar, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope we got to your questions, and I hope that you're thinking about issues in a new way as compared to you were just a little over an hour ago. I'll now like to turn the program back over to Dana.
Thank you, Gil. Thank you, Yolanda and Mijal, for an incredible conversation. We really appreciate your time and your wisdom. To quote a quote that came in from an audience member, Simon Sinek says, "If we really want people to talk more, we need to listen better." So thank you again for your ongoing partnership, and I am even more inspired to do this important work. And thank you to all of you for joining here today. Be sure to check out the full complement of offerings from Ideas for Today from the Shalom Hartman Institute. We'll be dropping a link in the chat. And be in the know about the latest ideas from Hartman. Subscribe to their email list to receive updates about their podcast, Identity Crisis and For Heaven's Sake, and their journal sources. The partnership between the Shalom Hartman Institute and the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington has been at the core of our collective effort to build a more vibrant, inclusive Jewish community. Through these conversations, we seek to elevate and address the most critical issues we are facing as a Jewish community and Jewish people. We are putting a link in the chat for you to learn more about the partnership and to view recordings of previous public programs that we've done together. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you and have a great day.